If you had to line all the apostles up, I get the vibe that for you, Paul is the cornerstone of the whole story.
Well, the reason I think he is somewhat different from what a lot of people say. Some people say that Paul invented Christianity. And that can't be true because Paul was persecuting Christians before he became a Christian. And so if he invented Christianity, he would have had nobody to persecute. So that's not right. And it's not right that he invented the idea that Jesus' death and resurrection brought about salvation, because that's what Christians were saying before him. The thing that made Paul really key, as I argue in this book, is that he realized that followers of Jesus, this Jewish Messiah sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people, followers of Jesus did not have to become Jewish. You could be a converted pagan and believe in Jesus and in the God of Jesus, but you didn't have to adopt the ways of Judaism. And this realization made it possible for Christianity to move away from being a sect within Judaism to being a worldwide religion. And if that hadn't happened, then Christianity would have ended up with the kind of historical significance of other Jewish sects. And they'd be as historically significant as the Sadducees or the Essenes, which are groups that are important for historians of ancient religion, but they're not exactly the sorts of things people worry about these days. And so he made it possible for Christianity to become what it did, which is the dominant religion of the empire.
If the Gospels of the New Testament were written long decades after the death, the written death of Jesus Christ, we're not talking about reporting. How do we get the Gospels if they were written by people who didn't actually see it happen?
Well, so what you do, historians do the same thing with the Gospels as they do with any other book. If they want to talk about, any figure in Roman history, for example, if they want to talk about Pompey, for example, or Crassus or Brutus, they look at what kind of sources are available. And sometimes for ancient people, we have contemporary sources, but more commonly, we have sources that are decades or even centuries later. If you've got independent sources that did not collaborate with one another, but they absolutely are independent of one another, and they all mention the same figure, that is pretty good evidence that there was a figure. With the Gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke all use some of the same sources, but usually scholars typically isolate 4 different sources behind Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, behind Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 4 sources, and they isolate 3 or 4 sources behind the Gospel of John. Paul had access to none of that stuff because Paul was writing before all that, and they didn't have access to Paul. You start adding up the sources, and you end up with 10 or 12 sources independently within a few decades that are all talking about this man Jesus. So if they'd all gotten it from one source, you'd say, well, somebody made it up. But it's kind of hard to say somebody made it up when you have all of these sources.